So, everybody who wanted to see the flames from our cauldrons, there you go. So, I'm gonna turn the lights back on. I turned them off to get a little more effect. Obviously, we got to keep the alcohol low and keep the flame low since we're indoors and we don't want to cause any problems. But as you can see, they work pretty good. And if I were to put a bunch more alcohol in them, the flames would really get cranking. But we'll keep it mellow since we're indoors. Flames, small looking flames, heat up the area. They produce a pretty good amount of heat. Okay, so today we need to talk about a subject that's not very well known about in a lot of circles, and it takes usually some workings and investigation and stuff to really get a feel for this stuff. But I want to talk about some reasons that people will have problems making progress, and some of them pertain to only to people who have made a certain amount of progress already. But this has to do with the Akasha, and I will try to explain what that is and how it affects everything we do, how it can be both the most effective tool possible and also the most effective hindrance possible, which usually comes out inadvertently. Usually happens inadvertently. So this Akasha that causes problems means that even some pretty advanced, I need to correct that. The Akasha causes no problems. The Akasha is perfectly balanced. And I guess we need to start with that to explain what it is. So the Akasha is prior to the elements, or some have called it the fifth element. It becomes a type of actual material substance at a point, and very fine, the most fine substance imaginable. The Akasha permeates everything, and that means everything that exists. And in a lot of ways, to me, it seems identically similar to what the Taoists talk about with the Tao. First off, I'm going to say why I want to talk about the Akasha, and that's because some things have come up. Somebody asked a question of why some individuals, such as powerful magicians, say effective magicians and things like that, have some situations they have to go through. Why, for example, Barden had to be arrested by the Nazis and couldn't get himself out of that. And he was somewhat of a special case. And I'll go into that more on the thing I'm planning on doing on Barden himself and who he was as a person and what we know about him. But yes, he had to undergo some things, and there were some other aspects. He's overweight. You wonder why, if he's that advanced of a magician. He smokes cigarettes, and I can think of several other things, and I will cover all those in the video. But one of the things that happens to magicians that are making a little bit of progress is they come across what has been termed in the past the dweller on the threshold. And you won't reach this dweller unless you already have a certain amount of ability. And what that means in this case, what we're speaking about, is not an actual being, though it could be personified as a being, and I've read cases of several people seeing it as a personified being. The dweller on the threshold is usually the Akasha. And the Akasha can be the biggest, best friend you've got and help to do things out, and also the worst enemy you've got, and can totally stop a magician's progress, totally stop a person's progress entirely, and make sure that all kinds of disasters befall a person so that they won't make progress. And that all depends not on the judgment of any being or individual, but on your own energies and thought forms and things you put out into the universe. Now, the Akasha is more easily accessible as you get better control over the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and as you get control over them both mentally, which means you're becoming mentally balanced in those aspects, and astrally, becoming astrally balanced, because the key aspect of Akasha is balance. Balance and harmony. The more the four elements are balanced in you and the more harmonious they are, the more effect that your thoughts and your feelings will have on the Akasha. And this is right where the problem comes in. Because as you make progress, if you're really making progress, then you are balancing your elements. That's the basic way to make progress in magical stuff. You need to balance the elements in your emotions, be emotionally balanced, mentally balanced, and then that opens up to you and makes it easier and easier to make contact with the Akasha. Not that you can't anyway, but it'll be easier for you the more in balance you are, and that's sort of the door that opens away the access to the inner stuff, the inner teachings and things. And the Akasha is a tough nut to crack, and especially in the Western world. But I also haven't found much useful about it in the translations from Hindu documents and things that I have read. Most of them just put it off. If you look in a dictionary, they'll put off Akasha as being space, say space or voidness, which is correct, but it's kind of like describing peanut butter by saying, well, it grows underground. And of course, the peanuts do, but that discards the shell and everything else. I mean, that's not a good analogy in particular, but I find that even in Western stuff, mostly, people do not have a good comprehension of the Akasha and the importance of that. And in my opinion, that's part of the reason why a lot of the good magicians and things, they don't actually make it to being what I would call an adept, and that is something quite a bit different than most Western magicians would call an adept, because I include an amount of enlightenment in that. You can be pretty adept at magic, but not necessarily very enlightened. But anyway, that's a whole nother subject. So to give you kind of an idea what the Akasha is to start with, it's everywhere. It's a substance that permeates everything, and it's both a substance and an energetic thing, energetic aspect, and the finest material substance a person can manage. And it is absolutely throughout everything. And I forgot a book that I'm going to have to go back and get, because I want to put some quotes from Coyote in here. And so I want to look some things up in the book that you said. But The Akasha, in my estimation, is the same thing the Taoists talked about when they're talking about the Tao. It and I should bring that in and read you some pieces from the Tao Te King. So I will, if I can find that and find that handily. Um, it pervades everywhere, and it doesn't exist in a sense. It exists everywhere and yet is found nowhere, would be one of the ways of putting it. Because it's like everything in the Akasha is in potential. It's like everything is balanced and harmonious there in the Akasha. And it's also there in potential. Um, so all the positives and negatives are there, ready to come down. And indeed, Akasha is known as the formative substance, the formative plane. Um, and forgive my use of that word because I know a lot of Western Kabbalists use that as Braya, I believe, or Yetzirah probably being the Akasha plane, the formative plane. But it's where everything comes from. You've probably heard the phrase the Akashic records. That's also because all events are recorded there, everything that has happened. And somebody who is in balance enough to read the Akashic records can easily look back into the past of people, past things, and see what happened. And again, there are reasons, good reasons, not to do that willy-nilly. So the advanced magician has to bind himself in a number of ways so that he can be free from his own issues. Before we go past describing it as the Tao, let me go get that book. Be right back. Okay, so I'm going to read a little translation. Who did this one? D.C. Lau. Looks like this is a little book on the Tao Te King. And they put it this way, and this is starting to talk about basically what it is, what the Akasha is. It says, the way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. The nameless was the beginning of heaven and earth. The named was the mother of myriad creatures. Hence always rid yourself of desires in order to observe its secrets, but always allow yourself to have desires in order to seek its manifestations. These two are the same, but diverge in name as they issue forth. Being the same, they are called mysteries, mystery upon mystery, the gatefold of the manifold secrets, or the gateway of the manifold secrets. Some of these terms they use, and I'm going to mention some of these because it's the same way Coyote talks about things. When he gave me a few of these to use of his own. So the idea is that a lot of these, if you want to talk about it, you have to talk about it by contrasting opposites. Because it consists of both. And it can be hard to understand at first until you get the feel for it. I picture it as a vast, though Akasha is actually colorless, I picture it as like the vastness of space, and yet it's filled with the invisible ether, in which is the potential manifestation of all things. And the only way to catch hold of it is to speak of it by opposites. So Here's a couple more sentences from the Tao Te King. The way is empty, yet use will not drain it. Deep, it is like the ancestor of the myriad creatures. Blunt the sharpness, untangle the knots, soften the glare, let your wheels move only along old ruts. Darkly visible, it only seems as if it were there. I know not whose son it is. It images the forefather of God. It is empty without being exhausted. The more it works, the more comes out. Much speech leads inevitably to silence. Better to hold fast to the void. So, it's harder to understand in the sense of Lao Tzu because of all the translations and the chances being pretty good that the translators didn't really comprehend it in its fullness, because that's difficult. And Coyote has given me some of these things which I have written down that are use this principle of speaking about opposites to try to reach something that is not rationally easily comprehensible and yet does exist. So these are aimed at self-development, but they use that idea. So one of them is, the Coyote says, God is because he is not. Okay, and the idea is to comprehend the meaning of that you cannot comprehend rationally. So a lot of these, some of them are funny. A lot of them are funny, but they're not intended to be aimed at your rational mind. Some of these things are just superficial on the surface too, or you can take them that way. Most of these things you can take two ways. Like, you can't climb to heaven on a ladder made of wood. Well, that seems kind of obvious, but there's a deeper meaning there. To seek it is to fall from it. Finding it makes you worthy of it. Pick a couple more here. The Tao, while abiding, is yet nowhere to be found. And by while abiding, it means, it's everywhere, all the time, always, and yet it's nowhere to be found. Okay. And this one also attempts to describe it. Reality lies beyond both wisdom and foolishness. And there's a equivalent one in there that I've got somewhere that one that I like. Where is it? Find it. Which is similar to that one. Unless you can learn from both a wise person and a fool, you have hardly learned at all. So the minute you become a wise man, you've lost it. You've lost the pathway. And the minute you become a fool. I hope this makes sense to some people. To seek after it is to fall from it. And these are hard to understand, but the idea isn't intellectual understanding. It's to reach a certain feeling. And awareness of the presence that is there that cannot be explained rationally. Okay, now that's a tough nut to start with right there. But we're going to go on, and we won't work trying to reach a full understanding of the Tao, because there is no way to convey that. There's no way to convey that understanding, that feel, except by these opposites that can take you there. Your part of you can go there, but it sort of bypasses your rational mind. So, and the opposites like that are also a development technique. Now, the Akasha as such, which we'll go back to, is all this and more. It's everywhere. We know it contains all of the records of everything that's happened, but it also contains all the thoughts and thought forms and feelings that people put out. And the astral plane could be considered as a density degree of the Akasha, a much dense version. Okay, so all of your thoughts and things are out there, and when you begin balancing your elements and you start getting into balance and start becoming a good magician, what would be termed in the Hermetic, or in the Western Hermetic stuff, what would usually be considered like reaching the 5th degree or the Tippereth stage, that is said when you go halfway up to meet God, God will come down to meet you. That's the point you start, or don't, have trouble with the Akasha, because you get your elements balanced and you start having more of an effect on it. The basic principle of the Akasha is harmony. If you do inharmonious things, this is where a lot of your karma comes back at you. If you do something inharmonious, take it this way, like everything in the universe is actually perfectly in balance if you take all of it simultaneously. But of course, everybody's in their own little part of the universe. So when you put something out there, when your brain starts affecting the Akasha, the more inharmonious your thoughts and feelings and things are that you have about yourself and about other people, but especially your own thoughts and feelings, those things will be reflected out into the Akasha, and they will come back on you sooner or later. Sometimes it might take 7 years for your karma to come back. But everything, every thought form, every feeling and everything will manifest down in your life. And the closer you come in contact with the Akasha, the stronger this effect will be. And that includes thoughts that you don't mean to think. If you have a nasty thought about somebody, it might accidentally manifest before you can get it under control. So it requires the control. And hopefully, if a person has advanced by controlling the elements far enough to reach this stage, then they have enough control to control their thought forms and their feelings to not be disharmonious. And that's one of the things that causes a problem with some more advanced adepts, is if they know really, and you really know, I know, that the things I do and the things I think will be directly reflected back to me as my karma at some point and in some way. This isn't an eye for an eye. It's an energy imbalance you set up by being disharmonious. And the energy imbalance, it's like pushing a lever, something happens here, makes something happen over here. Or like stepping off a cliff, you fall to the bottom under normal circumstances, assuming you're not wearing a parachute or something. So it's just a happening. It's not judgmental. And so a person's own karma isn't somebody making a judgment on them. It isn't God saying, I'm going to punish you with a thunderbolt. But it can be looked at objectively as strictly a result of your own past actions, especially in this life, but sometimes I believe karma can come from past lives, but mostly not. Most of your karma comes from this life and the things you're currently thinking. So that necessitates a real adept to be able to control their mind and control their thoughts and not be disharmonious. What that also means is they will generally react different in the company of buttheads or somebody being black magicians and things. Usually, so my feeling on this is uh, whatever immediate defense might be necessary to stop something nasty from happening, that's fine. But in somebody who's reached that stage, if they don't want to let it destroy them, then it makes sense that they bring themselves into harmony and realize that those people who did them wrong, there is no point and no purpose at all, actually, in doing revenge or getting back at them or doing nasty things to them, because once they know this, they'll have felt and experienced that all that karma comes right back to them. And it won't come back necessarily as an eye for an eye. So you throw a nasty spell at somebody, it doesn't mean they're going to throw one back at you necessarily, but it means that all that energy is going to come back to you, and it's going to affect you in a negative fashion along the lines of how you've affected others and how much you've affected them. So the karma will vary. You know, if you think a bunch of thoughts that doesn't affect somebody that much, well, who's to say? But it's going to come back on you, and will it affect you that much? And it tends to make a person lead to not be vindictive and not get revenge and things around people. If you can leave them to their own fate, they will seal their own karma and be subject to their own karma. And that is one of the things that Barden would do. It was mentioned specifically in a book by his son. This one here, by the way, Memories of Franz Barden. And this is by Lumir Barden and Dr. M.K. So Lumir Barden is his son, who talks about stuff that he experienced. And I don't know if he's still alive, but he was alive but very old. I saw an interview some 6 or 7 or 8 years back with him, something like that. And his main student, Dr. M.K. But they mentioned that Barden would often prefer to leave people who do nasty stuff to their own karma and not bother with them. And that would be unless something needs to be done. Sometimes some things just need to be taken care of, but an adept will try to do it in a way that will not damage their own karma. So you won't find a real adept throwing nasty spells. In fact, someone who generally does things like that proves by their actions that they are not an adept. And becoming an adept and becoming in harmony with that Akasha is one of the most powerful things is possible to do, and you can accomplish some of the most amazing and unbelievable things through contact with that Akasha. But you have to not be bitten by your own thought forms and things. So that is an example of one way that an advanced magician, you can't say they're really hindered in their actions, but it looks like it to an outside observer, because they got somebody nasty throwing spells at them maybe, and they do nothing about it. And that may be because they have enough protection, they don't need to worry about it, and they know that the person's own karma is going to do them in. And since the person is creating their own self-destruction by nasty karmas, why spend the energy on it? You know, do the immediate protection, keep yourself safe, your family safe, whatever it is you need to do. and leave the rest to take care of itself. And when people realize that every nasty thing they think even will eventually come back to them and manifest down. And like I say, it's not an eye for an eye, so to speak. If you do something nasty to somebody, it doesn't mean that same nasty thing will happen to you. It just means that same energy will come back into your life at some point, as if somebody external had brought it back to you, and the Akasha will do that, and it'll settle out that energy. It's like you start an energy imbalance and it has to compensate itself out. And its method of compensation becomes your karma. And so this energy will come back to you, but it will usually manifest in people not as an eye for an eye, but it'll come out at their weak points. It'll come out as some nasty energy attacking wherever they're weakest at, wherever they need the most control, where they're closest to losing control, that type of thing, because it's not so specific. It turns into what it turns into after you reabsorb it, after it recycles through into your life. And so, in a lot of ways, adepts and things might seem to be hindered in what they're doing, but really it's a cooperation with the universe. It's more like, not trying to paddle upstream. Way better off if you use a boat motor if you got to go upstream. But, that idea of cooperating with the universe. So if you're going to interpret or judge a magician or somebody, you should be very careful about doing that unless you're at that point where you're as much of a magician or as far developed as they are. And I'd be cautious of judging people even then, because your judgments will go out in the Akasha and they will come back to you also. So that is some of the stuff I wanted to mention to just get started on this. The Akasha, in some respects, is an actual substance. And I wanted to read to you what Barden says about it briefly here. Also, he says a lot about it, but there's this one introduction to it. So he says, when describing the element, I have mentioned several times that they originated from the etheric principle. Therefore, the etheric principle is the highest, the mightiest, the most unimaginable, the primordial existence, the original cause of all things and everything created. It is the causal sphere, where causes emanate from. Therefore, the Akasha is timeless and spaceless. It is uncreated, incomprehensible, and indefinable. The different religions call it God. It is the fifth energy, the primordial energy. It is that which created everything and, really important point, keeps everything in equilibrium. It is the source and purity of all thoughts and ideas. It is the causal world in which everything created maintains itself, beginning with the highest of spheres downward to the lowest. It is the quintessence of the elements. It is the all in all. In other words, it's not something you screw around with. I'll say that. However, you can use it in many different ways. And I won't go into that so much. But there was a point I wanted to bring out, and I may have to pause for a minute while I think about it, because I've lost my train of thought. But I guess that was all. Magicians have to be cautious about it. Well, everybody does. The Akasha can completely stop your magical progress entirely And there's an aspect of silence there also, because there are certain things that there are certain truths, certain aspects of reality that would bring great disharmony if they came out into the public and became publicly known. And I am not talking about anything people do, uh, anything, the hidden stuff, but it's hidden because people aren't ready for it, and because with their own thoughts and anxieties and astral aspects and things, if it came out and it believed them and they believed it and they understood it, it would cause total chaos among certain people. And therefore, it is not to be known. Now, I have read of an instance which I believe was due to the Akasha and due to this, and I won't go into too many details because it's mostly my suspicion. I cannot read the Akasha to the point of telling if it's true or not, but there was a guru who was being flown in a private airplane, and he had commented that he was doing space and time magic, and he had planned on sharing that with his followers and things. And I believe there was a plane crash. The plane crashed into a mountain. It was a small private plane, and he was the only one killed, basically the only one hurt, I believe, was my understanding, in the plane crash. And I honestly suspect the Akasha took him out because he was going to reveal something that would create that disharmony and imbalance. The balance and harmony is a self-correcting aspect. So those who unbalance things will be corrected. But that also means that there are certain things that an individual, a person, will never know if they can't keep silence. You have to have the ability to keep silence on certain understandings and things that, if you blurt them out, will create chaos. And I'm going to mention something here that I was reiterated again. Now, many years ago, long before YouTube, I did a little ritual with a friend of mine, two friends of mine, but for one friend of mine who wanted to just break into starting into magic. So I wrote what I thought was a very small, little benign ritual to put him through. And I ran it by Siofra, and she thought it was benign. Okay. But we didn't take into account two things. The first was we're both young enough that we were just doing LSD, and that didn't improve matters any. But also we were doing it in a very sacred place with very powerful energies behind it. And while doing the ritual, and I took note of it, but I didn't realize the implications at the time, the candle we were using for the earth quarter fell over while we were doing this little ritual. And it seemed simple, like we're talking a 10-minute ritual. Okay. And my friend is not, he's sharp, he's smart, he's aware. He was a drill sergeant in the Army. And this knocked the footing right out from under him. And I had no idea at the time, because I was having a panic attack, and I didn't know that I was having panic attacks at the time. That was before I was diagnosed with it. But it gave him this experience which harmed him for years. Now, the ritual was basically the idea that he would be blindfolded and tied, and then he would say that he wants enlightenment and freedom, and he had to step over a line, and then the blindfold would be removed to symbolize the enlightenment, and the ties around his hands would be removed for freedom. But it turned out this had a major negative effect on him for many, many years. And just seeing my friend recently, it really struck home to me again uh, how this has affected him, and still is a major factor in his life. And this was well over 30 years ago, or at least a little over 30 years ago, that we did this. And it still affected him. And to my dismay, because I never realized, I thought this was a harmless little introduction to the magical stuff that he could go through. But instead, as symbolized by the knocking over, by the falling over of the earth candle, which just kind of fell over on its own, it knocked his feet right out from under him. He felt like his soul was going to be ripped completely from his body when he died. There would be nothing left of him. He would be disintegrated. So these are not things you screw around with without knowing what you're doing and very careful consideration. I wouldn't have done anything of the sort if he hadn't been a very good friend at the time, and I was all enthusiastic about magical stuff, um, having discovered it. And um, so the Akasha can give you some hard lessons too. And um, I can't say that I have noticed anything that has been backlash on me from doing that, but I have no doubt that there was, because I, with the best of intentions, inadvertently caused a bunch of chaos in my friend's life. I hope in the end he will have, and I believe he has, grown from it and learned something from it, and he used that to help to better take control of his life. And he said he helped it to get him off the influence of psychedelics and LSD and things like that. So all in all, I hope it's been good, and I hope I've learned something from it. But that just goes to show you how easily you can do some small little thing, trying to be good, trying to help somebody and do a good thing, and get results that are way out of proportion to what you expect. And especially with the Akasha, things can get really inflated and, magnified in a way that you won't really be able to predict. So that's one of the reasons you don't just mess with the Akasha. And that's one of the reasons why more advanced magicians have certain things that they will not do, because they've learned over time that it's detrimental to them and they're better off to let persons take their own karma. So I think that's about enough of the subject for now. It's probably been too long for some of you anyway. So I will go on and go do one about Barden that explains the special case of him and why he had to undergo a bunch of negative stuff that he could have solved by healing himself or by escaping from the prison when he was imprisoned by the Nazis and things like that. But he couldn't do, he had to restrain himself, because he would have ended up in a worse place if he hadn't. And I'll go into that more when I explain who he was and what he did and his stage magic, which I will mention. He did do stage magic, and there are pictures of him, but he did real stage magic, not sleight of hand. He did the real deal in front of people. And he went under the stage name of Frabato, which stood for Franz Barden. And I don't know how to pronounce it. It's like Topava. So the Fraba To, Fraba To, yeah. And then the O was another thing from the T, and then the O from another place he was at, and I can't recall that from the book, and we don't need to look it up right now, but so I think everybody will find that interesting. I hope this has been useful and not a wandom, wandom, invented a new word, random wandering and that uh, rambling. But I think it is useful for people to know, and I think not very many Western magicians and Wiccans are aware of how deep the aspect of the Akasha goes and how it affects everybody and everything. So hopefully this will clear things up a little bit. I know it's very hard to comprehend, which is why Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te King, so that people would have something to grab onto. Because you say you can't define it, it's nameless. The harder you search for it, the less visible it is. You know, um, it gives you a method to use to try to grasp the subject that is not really graspable by the rational mind. So that's the end of this for now. This has been Ian Coyote. I hope you all have a good day, weekend, evening, whatever time or whatever it happens to be for you. And thank you for watching this far if you did. Blessed be.